has man really been to the moon? It's been 50 years and the debate rages on. For the first time, a film compiles in a single piece of work all the best evidence in favor of the moon landings and the evidence contrary to them.
I russi sono stati zitti perché? Nessuno ce lo sa spiegare.
Now, nearly 40 years after the first moon landing, NASA has confessed that the original film depicting Neil Armstrong's giant leap has been lost.
What was the Apollo project really? The biggest achievement in the history of mankind, or the biggest fakery of all times, watched on live television by more than 500 million people?
Le foto avrebbero dovuto essere state fatte sulla Luna portandosi un'attrezzatura da studio.
What's up with the moon trips? There's a program being sponsored by Flyby News at the Greenfield Public Library on March 23rd, 2019. It's a Saturday morning from 10 a.m. till noon, and each following month on the third Saturday of the month from 10 a.m. to noon, which is April 20th, May 18th, June 15th, and July 20th, 2019. Did Neil Armstrong leap onto the lunar surface about 50 years ago? While many believe they saw this happen on TV, Flyby News, an online news service that exposed NASA's high-risk Cassini Plutonium Earth flyby in 1999, calls the event a military psychological operation. It just did not happen as it was portrayed, said Jonathan Mark, publisher of the website flybynews.com. It took me years researching this event before I could actually talk about it and the images that can be seen from Apollo lunar missions. Ever since those missions, astronauts have only claimed to venture in low Earth orbit. There they receive the same protection from deadly cosmic rays as Earth does from its electromagnetic shield called the Van Allen belts. This is the reason the Russians never attempted to send an astronaut to the moon. According to NASA spokesperson for the 2014 Orion mission, Kelly Smith, the Van Allen radiation belts contain dangerous radiation, and that, quote, NASA must first solve this challenge before we send people through this region of space. It appears reasonable to question if 6 missions to the moon and back actually happened with 1960s technologies. Even today, we don't have the ability to protect life on such a journey. The main obstacle in questioning something many of us believe most of our lives is cognitive dissonance, our worldview, which is uncomfortable to challenge. Also, many get emotional over this issue. There is national pride at stake. If you do question those missions, you may receive ridicule. This keeps many away from the topic. In 1969 to 1972, Apollo had less computer power than one smartphone. Are you willing to join in the debate in 2019 and do some research? Flyby News is offering events with monthly discussions and films to explore such questions and possible answers. Has the military taken over NASA and truth in space? With all the chaos in our world, we can see how dangerous it is to abandon science and integrity by our institutions. Inevitably, truth will prevail, but it's unclear how long it will take. As Mark Twain said, it is easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. Did man really walk on the moon 50 years ago? This July 20th is going to be the 50th anniversary. A small step for a man becomes a big leap for mankind. Well, we're questioning if that really happened because nothing's happened since. Ever since the 1972 Apollo missions, all flights have been in low Earth orbit. And this film explains it pretty well.
Hi everyone, and welcome to yet another controversial Better Mankind video. I think subconsciously there must be a part of me that enjoys the onslaught of nasty comments when I make videos like this. But the fact remains that there's way more evidence that supports the theory that we never went to the moon than there is to support that we ever did. Now there are many reasons that prove we never went to the moon. To mention a few, you have the wavy flag in a zero atmosphere environment, the lack of any blast crater underneath the lunar module, Or how about the absence of stars in space? The problem with any of these arguments is that NASA seems to have an explanation for every single one of them. Therefore, people like me and other moon landing deniers are referred to as a bunch of crazy tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy kooks that need to up their medication. So in this video, I'm only going to address a single discrepancy that NASA themselves have admitted to on more than one occasion, and will prove without a doubt that we have never even left low Earth orbit, let alone landed a man on the moon. But first, let's go back to school and get a refresher course on the different atmospheres surrounding the Earth. Now, the following information is critical to proving my point, so please bear with me. First, we have the troposphere. This is where all of our weather occurs, and it is the lowest layer of the Earth's atmosphere. It starts at the Earth's surface and extends up to a height of 4 to 10 miles. Next, we have the stratosphere, which extends to about 35 miles above the Earth's surface. This is where our ozone layer resides and protects us from those dangerous UV rays. It is also the layer where aircraft travels, as it is free from weather disturbances. Now we go up to the mesosphere, where most meteors burn up on entry. The mesosphere stretches up to 50 miles above the Earth's surface. Next, we have the thermosphere, and this layer extends up to 400 miles from the Earth's surface, and the air here is very thin. Also, temperatures here start to get really hot, ranging anywhere from 200 to 500 degrees Celsius and 500 to 2000 degrees Celsius in the upper region. And last but not least is the exosphere. The temperature in the exosphere can vary from 0 to 1700 degrees Celsius. The exosphere is the outermost layer of the Earth's atmosphere and is around 6,200 miles from the Earth's surface. Now, according to NASA, low Earth orbit is around 1,200 miles from the Earth's surface. So before I tell you the reasons why it is impossible for us to go beyond the exosphere, or for that matter even past the thermosphere, have a listen to what some NASA experts have to say about this topic.
As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
Hang on. So what you're saying is that in order to send humans through this region, we need to solve the challenge of getting through the Van Allen radiation belts? But I'm confused. Didn't you already solve this challenge back in 1969 when you sent astronauts to the moon, and subsequently 5 other times after that?
But we're also really pushing the boundaries in terms of where we're going forward with exploration. I think humans are naturally driven to do this, and this is really the beginning, I think, of human beings leaving low Earth orbit. I certainly plan on being around to see that.
So she's a NASA astronaut, but I guess no one bothered to tell her about the first time that we left low Earth orbit. I guess she might be a little too young to remember. Here we have another astronaut that wasn't told about the moon landing 48 years ago.
The plan that NASA has is to build a rocket called SLS, which is a heavy lift rocket. It's something that is much bigger than what we have today, and it will be able to launch the Orion capsule with humans on board, as well as landers or other components to destinations beyond Earth orbit. Right now, we only can fly in Earth orbit. That's the farthest that we can go. And this new system that we're building is going to allow us to go beyond and hopefully take humans into the solar system to explore. So the moon, Mars, asteroids, there's a lot of destinations that we could go to, and we're building these building block components in order to allow us to do that eventually.
Once we travel beyond low Earth orbit, the crew will be exposed to larger amounts of radiation. So we have to design both the crew protection systems and our electronic systems to withstand this radiation.
So that would mean that Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin were a tough bunch of SOBs able to withstand all that brutal radiation, considering these challenges are still yet to be solved. So how is it that we had the technology to achieve this amazing feat back in 1969, but we're still working on the technology in 2017, almost half a century later? Well, I managed to find a very clever and well-informed astronaut that will totally straighten things out for us and explain exactly why we're not able to return to the moon and break through those Van Allen radiation belts. Have a listen to this clever chap.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
This guy, oh boy. Here's a real-life example of what can happen to you when you're exposed to all of that outer space radiation. And if you're a child with aspirations of becoming an astronaut, being a very good liar might be a positive attribute to have on your resume. Now, just by showing you these admissions of guilt by NASA, I can easily end this video now, and I would have easily proven my point without a shadow of a doubt. But I'm sure that for some of you hardened skeptics out there, this damaging evidence is still not enough. So let's take this theory of mine to the next level. This here is the lunar module now proudly displayed at the National Air and Space Museum. According to NASA, the primary materials used to build the module were aluminium alloy, stainless steel, titanium, nickel steel alloy, heat-resistant glass. Now, if this is the case, we have a very serious discrepancy here. If you remember earlier when I went through the different atmospheres that surround the Earth, both the thermosphere and exosphere have temperatures ranging from 0 to 2000 degrees Celsius. So I decided to examine the melting points of the primary metals that were used to build the lunar module. First off, we have the aluminium alloy, which has a melting point of 463 degrees Celsius. Next we have stainless steel, which has a melting point of 1510 degrees Celsius. Then we also have nickel steel alloy, which melts at 1453 degrees Celsius, and of course the heat resistant glass for the windows, which has a melting point of 760 degrees Celsius. So this would mean that the lunar module, along with its occupants, would have disintegrated well before it even passed through the thermosphere, let alone surviving the Van Allen radiation belts in the exosphere. To protect the astronauts from the Van Allen radiation belts, the lunar module would have required 6 feet of lead shielding. But here's what they really had for protection.
Obviously, the only shielding they had was the literally paper-thin outer hull of aluminum, and their suits consisting of glass fiber, some aluminum fibers, and silicon rubber.
It's very interesting concerning radiation that the astronauts were protected by a thin film of aluminum, when here on Earth they put a lead shield on us when they take a dental x-ray.
In conclusion, when NASA themselves admit to never having left low Earth orbit, and the fact that we don't even have the materials that could withstand the extreme temperatures and cosmic rays in space, how on earth can anyone believe that we ever went to the moon? Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you like my content, please give me the thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also, if you have your own opinions about the moon landing, feel free to leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts. Until next time, take care and be good to each other.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Flyby News got involved with this subject because we're involved with peace in space by first working with the investigative reporter Carl Grossman in the Cassini Earth Flyby, which was a space mission that was headed towards Saturn, but instead of going straight to Saturn, they launched it, they went the opposite direction of Venus, and they did 2 flybys around Venus to accelerate it. And it had 72.3 pounds of highly radioactive plutonium on board, and they came back for an Earth flyby. So on August 18, 1999, which is 20 years this August, they did a flyby, which is a slingshot effect, using the gravity of the Earth to slingshot it so they can get to Saturn faster. The trouble was, if they had an inadvertent re-entry into the atmosphere, which extends at least 75 miles up, and it would only take less than a minute if there was a problem with the trajectory of it. It would have released all this plutonium radiation that would be exposing 5 billion people of the planet to an amount of radiation that could cause cancer in many, many, many people. So in being aware of this, Carl Grossman also gave me the website for the Project for a New American Century. And there was plans by the military. They had a program called Vision 2020 And by year 2020, they were calculating back then that they wanted to control the space with weapons for U.S. interests on Earth, take the highest ground. So that got us upset. So we were first trying to stop the weaponization of space. And because of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty back in 1972, there was no weapons going into space. It was after 9/11 in 2001, George Bush Jr. terminated the ABM treaty using 9/11 as an excuse or a reason where they did everything else with the Patriot Act and other issues, launching wars and claiming there was weapons of mass destruction. They actually started putting weapons in space. So that's why we had to start investigating 9/11, because no longer were able to stop the arms race from expanding into space. And that led us to 9/11, the election theft of 2000, and while I was working on that, because Flyby News was reporting news for life survival in the 21st century, came across a film by Bart Sibrel called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon.
Since the beginning of recorded history, the human race has been at war. First with members of their own family, then their fellow countrymen, and finally nations at large. Yet perhaps the starting ground for all these conflicts lays somewhere deeper, within the very character of the human condition, in the dark, untouchable crevices of the human heart. It is said that the first iniquity of free will began even before the maiden pilgrimage from the embryo, preceding the very creation of the earth itself, in the forelife of souls in the heavenly realms. The dawn of warfare, some believe, was initiated by a fallen angel whose trespass against God was pride. In ancient Babylonia, in an age so long ago that the exact millennium remains in question, the Tower of Babel began construction. It was to be the single greatest achievement of the human race. A tower so tall that its summit would reach the heavens, and by it prove to the world that their race was superior. It would be God's irony that it would never be finished. Time passed, nations fell, a machine age emerged, and once again the ingenuity of the species which held dominion over all others unveiled what was at the time the most monumental accomplishment ever imagined, the largest machine yet constructed. An automation so mammoth and so revered, even before its first demonstration, that its only befitting name was Titanic. On April 10th, 1912, it set sail. It was boasted to be the ship that God himself could not sink. It would be God's irony that the very element that was meant to keep it afloat would cause it to sink. Water, frozen water, in the form of an iceberg. Not even one voyage did it complete. And then the next age embarked into the annals of human history, perhaps the last age, the space age. Competition for victor was unparalleled. Powerful nations spent billions in unabashed rivalry to outdo the other. The Soviet Union launched the first orbiting satellite, the first animal, the first man. They had logged 500% more hours in space than the United States. And in June of 1969, they launched an unmanned probe to the moon to retrieve the first soil sample from another world, just 1 month before Apollo 11. That's how close the race was. Had their unmanned probe not crash-landed into the lunar surface, the first moon rock brought back to Earth would have been by the Soviet Union. Richard Nixon, president at the time, had this to say about the latest work of the human hand. It is the greatest week since creation, the greatest event since the laying of the foundation of the seas, since the origin of the universe itself, since the design and formation of the delicate human eye through which all these things are perceived, was a flying machine with its 2 passengers landing on its closest celestial neighbor and returning from where it came. Perhaps again, God's irony lies somewhere within this great boast of humankind. The building of the tallest tower for the sole purpose of standing out among the races was never finished. The machine that was so great that it was said to be untouchable by even God never completed its first voyage. And finally, the crowning achievement of humankind, the greatest boast of the species, the event in human history most associated with pride in our own accomplishments, landing on the moon. 20 years later, and years behind schedule, the same space program couldn't put into Earth orbit a telescope with a lens that focused. And yet 2 decades earlier, a mission 100 times more complicated worked on its first occasion. With close scrutiny of the motives of the zealous Nixon administration, a critical examination of the entirely government-controlled press coverage, and newly discovered footage of the crew of Apollo 11 staging part of their mission, we wish to detail what may come to be the greatest government conspiracy of all time. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Unbeknownst to the citizenry, high above the Earth, beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles, lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo. The more experienced Soviets spent 100 hours in space for every 20 hours of the US. In order to survive the hour-and-a-half journey through this radiation field necessary to reach the moon and return, solid lead shielding between the astronauts and the exposure outside would be required. The mammoth Saturn V rocket used by Apollo was already 35 stories tall and weighed as much as a battleship. To add additional tonnage in the form of a lead barrier completely surrounding the crew members would have made it impossible for the vehicle to get off the ground. That is why the Soviets, though more advanced, only sent an unmanned probe to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft's narrowest shielding was less than 1/8 of an inch of light aluminum. In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect, not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station, and can create high charges deep inside of these objects. if it was impossible to better the Soviets in the space race, which was really a race of technological armaments, what could be done? How could America offset the threat of superior weaponry? Throughout the history of rivalry and war, astute generals of lesser armies than their counterparts have used deceit and misinformation as a method to achieve victory. In World War II, for example, columns of inflatable tanks were placed at locations afar from Normandy to draw German forces away from the real location of invasion. The Star Wars missile defense program rigged tests to make it seem more advanced than it really was. That's the conclusion of the General Accounting Office. The aim was to fool the Soviet Union about US military readiness during the Cold War. Certainly, it was not possible to fool just the Soviets about US strategic capability in the 1960s, while somehow informing 200 million Americans of the truth secretly. In order for them to believe the United States had the capability to go to the moon, everyone would have to believe it. Furthermore, the pride of a nation was at stake, and the goal of a martyr, not to mention the growing unrest domestically of a government throwing tens of thousands of lives away in a foreign war riddled with contradiction and ambiguity. In addition, the Apollo program had already spent billions of dollars. If it failed to achieve its goal with such an investment, it would indeed be a large and bitter pill for the taxpayers to swallow. The cost of the program, whose sole goal was to be the first to plant a flag on the lifeless rock just outside the Earth, if adjusted for inflation to the 21st century, was $135 billion. With a profit margin of just 7%, this would be equal to over $9 billion profit going to the privileged contractors chosen by their friends at NASA. If the machinery was in fact only achieving Earth orbit, as other earlier missions had already done, then the completion and functionality of the other components would not have been as important, and even more profit would have been made. The fact that the Apollo program was so departmentalized, with various construction and test sites around the country, meant that only a few people saw the whole picture. And for the first time ever, there was no independent press coverage of such an historical event. Whatever pictures and sound were distributed to the public were strictly controlled and previewed by the federal government. They were then disseminated unchecked until this hour. For who would realize that the unthinkable was not only possible, but absolutely true?
And the truth will set us free.